Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 21 of Paul's first epistle to Corinth, and we're covering 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 11 through 16. And this one's called This Passage Speaks Volumes. In our previous lesson, we covered a passage that seems to offend many professing believers. But if we are offended by any verses in the Bible, it reveals that we are not honoring God for being the God He is. Paul informed us, and Peter also stated the same, that women are to be submissive to men and are the weaker vessels. There are many women offended by this statement, but as explained in our previous lesson, this has nothing to do with a person's talents or abilities. It is simply about God's design of order. There are plenty of others offended anytime Paul mentioned the word slave or servant, drawing a correlation to the slavery that occurred in the American South. As believers, we should be bondservants of Jesus Christ. After all, He purchased us with His blood and by His death, paying the enormous price that we owed. Some professing believers pick and choose which verses are acceptable to them and which verses are unacceptable. As stated in our previous lesson, our only choice is to believe them all or not to believe them all. Only by believing all of the Bible can we be followers of Jesus. Otherwise, by choosing not to believe even one biblical statement or promise, we're calling God a liar. There are many professing Christians who do not believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, and just as many others who do not believe that Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead. By disbelieving either of these claims, we shrink God, at least in our beliefs. When doing this, we think that He is incapable of doing something that is beyond our understanding, with our extremely limited brains. But God's will is not changed by our limited beliefs. Let's continue the discussion from our previous lesson and begin by reading our passage today, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 11 through 16, which says this: Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. But all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. When God gave the gift of marriage, He said this in Genesis 2:24, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Once again, He said this to Adam and Eve, even though neither had an earthly father or mother. There's no independence when two are joined into one. That relationship designates complete interdependence upon each other. As discussed in our previous passage, in the order that God designed, the woman is the weaker vessel and should submit to her husband. At the same time, the husband is supposed to love his wife the way that Christ loves the church. For those who do not follow this analogy, that means that husbands should love their wives sacrificially. But what also is revealed in this simple statement in Genesis concerning marriage is that both will leave their fathers and mothers. Even though both fathers and mothers have lasting impacts on their children, in most situations, mothers spend more time with the children and may even more deeply affect these children. This does not sound like a silent partner in the development of the next generation. This was God's plan, just as much as His designed order in the relationship between man and woman, that man is the covering to women. We also need to look at that man comes through woman. What that means is that the women will bear these children, and some of those children are going to be boys that will become men. Our culture has focused on equality, but as stated in our previous lesson, men and women are equal in many capacities, but equal does not mean they are the same. That point is glaringly obvious, and at the same time reveals the foolishness that comes when we attempt to replace God with our own thoughts and feelings. What comes to mind is the fairly new issue of biological men competing against biological women in athletics. The world's new fascination with transgenders is about the most ridiculous thing in the world's history. We can find no direct or specific Bible verse to promote or condemn transgenderism, as this surgery was not done until 1930. But even though the Bible was written many years before that first ridiculous surgery, we know that God is incapable of sin and incapable of making a mistake. If a boy is born and somewhere down the road decides that he feels like a girl, does that mean that God had him born as a boy because God made a mistake? Or does it mean that the boy's feelings are incorrect? This is very easy to answer for a Christian, but this is another one of those examples of how professing believers are willing to compromise what the Bible teaches us about God. Back to the point I was making, though, we can see the differences between men and women physically. But those differences are not just limited to the physical. We also are keenly aware of the differences emotionally. Is it any wonder that God designed the family with both mothers and fathers? Together, they both can teach different things in different ways to their children. And both parents are vitally important in that child's growth and development. But a man is called to leave his parents and be the covering for his own wife. Another one of the differences between men and women is the length of hair, outwardly noticeable. And it's interesting that many of the portraits drawn of Jesus, or statues created of Jesus, depict him with long hair. Certainly these are inaccurate, as the Old Testament tells us this in Ezekiel 44:20. They shall neither shave their heads nor let their hair grow long, but they shall keep their hair well trimmed. And the New Testament tells us this. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? We can see this in God's design, as there are many men, particularly older men, who are follically challenged. Testosterone causes hair on the head to fall out. Other than Sinead O'Connor or a woman going through chemotherapy, most of us have never seen a bald-headed woman. Bald-headed men, on the other hand, are as constant as the northern star and as the southern drawl. Paul stated that even nature tells us that when a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him. Why? Well, part of this likely has to do with the fact that God designed us to be different. Men should not resemble women, and women should not resemble men. I remember a time in junior high when my sister had very short hair, and a teacher took her to the principal's office for being in the girls' bathroom. Of course, the principal was able to figure out that she really was a girl. I do remember my exultant joy in hearing about this when it happened. I also remember a story from a dear family friend who is now a pastor. As a teenager, he was driving around with a friend in his Volkswagen Beetle and saw a girl with long, beautiful hair riding a bicycle. He decided to stick his arm out of the car window and tap that girl's bottom with his hand. His understanding of math was deficient, though, as he did not grasp that his arm was moving at 30 miles an hour, much faster than the bicycle. Very shortly, his arm came to a complete stop, while the car was still doing 30, and that severe change caused his arm to hit the window frame and break his arm. The girl flew off the bike. He told us that looking back before hightailing it out of there, he saw that the girl who had been knocked off the bike had a beard. There's a man who would not have been knocked off his bike or spanked with power if he simply had gotten a haircut. In biblical times, men and women wore fairly similar clothing. with the major differences being the length of the tunic and the type of head covering. Women's tunics were longer than the men's, going to the ankles, while the men's tunics went to the knees. The head coverings for women were a veil, while a man would typically wear a turban or a soft cap. Today we see many men dressing more effeminately and many women dressing more masculinely. God made us different because he wanted us to be different. A woman's glory is her hair, and that is part of the exemplified covering. Once again, in church, a woman's head was to be covered to signify that her husband was her covering, if married. Her father was likely her covering if she was unmarried. There's another passage that comes later in 1 Corinthians that gives us even more information concerning this. 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 through 35 says this, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church." This passage comes in a chapter that explains order within the church, and before this passage, it discussed the order of speaking in tongues and prophesying in church. Though this passage follows up on that, we can tell by the language that it is referring to more than tongues and prophecy done by women. Instead, the language specifically states, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says." This was not something new in the Christian church. It had also been a part of the requirements in the Jewish synagogues of the Old Testament. It is amazing how many churches today completely disregard this passage, and we often see women teachers and pastors. Along with this, we also see another responsibility for the husbands. They are to help to teach their wives. This will involve the men paying attention in church so they can answer the questions from their wives. Men are the covering of women, which reminds us that women are not to teach men and not to pastor men. Does this mean that women cannot be gifted as teachers? Does it mean that women cannot be gifted as prophets or with the gift of tongues? No, women are not to teach men, but they certainly can teach women. Here's an example from Titus. Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 5 says this, "But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. The older women likewise, that they may be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed." If I was in a church and a woman was teaching, I would leave, because that would tell me that the church ignores some of the teaching of the Bible and likely would ignore many other verses as well. Here's a passage from Acts that tells us of some women with the gift of prophecy. Acts chapter 21, verses 7 through 9 says this, "And when we had finished our voyage from Tyre, we came to Ptolemais, greeted the brethren, and stayed with them one day. On the next day, we who were Paul's companions departed and came to Caesarea and entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied." Certainly these daughters of Philip were not prophesying in the temple, in the synagogue, or in the church. To me, this is an important passage for a number of reasons. First, it reminds us of the order that exists in God's design and reminds us of the fact that men and women are not interchangeable. Any designer has a purpose in his design, and that is tangible in God's design as well. In our culture, there are many churches to choose between. How a church adheres to the Bible is one of the many ways that we can know how strongly that church desires to follow God. A church with a female pastor is not even worth a look, unless it is a church for all women and you're a woman. There are plenty of households with a believing wife and an unbelieving husband. If the wife left it up to the husband to teach the children about the Lord, they would not learn anything. In the home, it is best with a believing husband as the spiritual leader of the household. But there are times when the woman teaches her children because her husband will not do his duty. There also are many godly women who are leading women's groups, but it is problematic to reinterpret the Bible by believing that the Bible's words cannot be applied correctly to our culture. Again, God gave us these words, and He can see the past, present, and future. He does not change. What gives us the right to change His word? This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.